Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop, and you are listening to the SonicScoop podcast, where we talk about the mindsets behind mixing and mastering. We get serious about sound, and we talk about treating your career like a creative business, because it is one. And I have a really special guest on today that I am super excited to have on. This is a guy from a company that has been really changing the way that people make and process audio. And we're going to be talking about getting the most out of your monitoring situation. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a big evangelist for the first and most important piece of gear outside of your ears and yourself in the studio is the actual room environment that you're in. And that means everything from speakers to the room to potentially EQ correction that you might be placing in that speaker and room environment to improve things further. All three of those, I think, are essential in this day and age for getting the most out of your listening environment so you can make great critical listening decisions. And my guest can talk about all three of those, but very specifically about the very last one. His name is Martins Popelis, and he is from a company called Sonarworks. Martins, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great to have you on the show. And one of the reasons I want to talk to Martins, I was actually a bit of a skeptic of EQ correction. When I was studying audio initially, I started getting into audio in the late 90s and started going to college for it in the early 2000s. And back then, EQ correction was kind of like, it's something that some big studios did, but it didn't always work particularly well. And it was something that was out of the question for a lot of smaller studios. But Sonarworks has completely changed that. And I don't want to just only plug his product. I want to talk about some of the core concepts here, where if you're starting to use EQ correction, and that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting for skewed frequency response in your room, what are the things you need to think about when it comes to speaker selection, when it comes to room treatment in that environment, how much you should be allocating to each of these, and what are the things you want to think about in each of those categories. Martins is a really, I think you'll find, super articulate guy, really well-spoken, really thoughtful on this stuff. I invited him on the podcast personally. He did not ask to be on here, although Sonarworks has sponsored the podcast in the past. I asked him to be on for this episode because I've been blown away every time I've talked to him. I think you're going to be blown away by some of his insights too. Before we get into it, the briefest of shout outs to the sponsors for this episode. One of them is Focusrite. You're actually hearing me talking through a Focusrite claret interface right now. They make great bang for the buck stuff, really just solid stuff from the entry-level Scarlett line all the way up to their Red Net series for pro studios. Also, big shout out to Eventide and Soundtoys, both of them making some of my favorite creative mixing effects. You can try out any of the software that either of those companies make for free. Check them out, eventideaudio.com and soundtoys.com. With all that out of the way, Martins, thank you for joining me all the way from Latvia.
Well, again, thanks for having me. And now I'll have to, I don't have a choice. I'll have to live up to your introduction of myself. So
you're going to have to. It's either that or you're going to turn into a total blubbering idiot now that I've said all these nice things about you. But I doubt it. I totally doubt it. Okay. So, Martins, right. I want to start off on this idea of Sonarworks has really taken off. You're finding it in a lot of places. But I want you to give me a sense for why this didn't take off sooner. You know, because in the past, I mean, people have known for decades that, yeah, no room is ever going to be perfect. No set of speakers is ever going to be perfect. We can use EQ to adjust things. But why didn't that take off in the past? I mean, you could have just gotten a measurement mic and a graphic EQ and tried to do stuff, but it never took off in the way that Sonarworks did. And I would say it's because a lot of those solutions didn't work that well. So what's different now? How has the technology changed that's made it make sense for more studios?
All right. So Sonarworks technology is quite different from the solutions that have been out before. When we started off, it was actually also a lot of critique and kind of skepticism that we were getting and hearing from people saying, hey, yes, I've tried, room EQ doesn't work, sorry, kind of you have to fix the room. Mm-hmm. And before we start getting into the equalization of the room through a software solution, let me state that actually here at Sonarworks, we also still believe in room tuning and room construction. So generally, the formula that we subscribe to is, hey, get a decent to good to great pair of speakers, basically get as good speakers as you can, then get the room to sound as good as you can with the analog methods, with building out the room and placing the speakers and making sure it sounds as good as it gets. When you get to that best possible sound that's kind of you can get to with an analog mean, then consider putting a thing like Sonarworks on top of it. So we're not advocating by any means kind of replacing room tuning with a software solution. We're saying for any current situation of the room and the speakers that you find yourself in, the software tuning of the room might be the shortest, quickest, and best price performance improvement in that room that you might find. But by all means, kind of keep doing the best job possible with the room in an analog manner. So that's kind of an introductory word. So the aim of this whole room tuning is to get the speaker and the room to sound as neutral as possible, to kind of not add anything to the sound and not take anything away from it, so that you can be sure that all of your creative ideas that you are transforming into music through your computer, that when you monitor those ideas and you assess what's now went into the file, that you're hearing them as accurately as possible, and neither the room nor the speakers are adding or taking anything away from that, right? So you want to hear it as accurate as it is in the file without any kind of coloration coming from the speakers or the room. So when you then talk about, let's measure the room and find out the coloration that it brings, then the first question that comes up is, okay, so what are we measuring? So the simple answer is we're measuring the frequency response. But then how are we measuring the frequency response? Well, we're measuring it with a measurement microphone. A measurement microphone is a mic that has a neutral frequency response, so it doesn't add or color the sound in any way, so you can rely on it and get a frequency response reading. But then the interesting angle there is that a human being actually does not hear sound in the same way as a measurement microphone does. So for a measurement microphone, you make one measurement here, another one like a few inches away, and another one still a few inches away from there. You will actually see three different frequency responses, and depending on the room or your setup, those frequency responses might actually be quite significantly different from each other. So then you're saying, okay, now I have my EQ. I want to tune the room with my EQ. I just made these three measurements. Now, which one is the right one? What should I use to kind of tune my room, right? And that's a very good question. And I think the early versions of a room EQ solution did just that. They kind of asked you to make a measurement, and then you find kind of an EQ, and then it just applies that EQ. And most people find, in most of the cases, that's just kind of going to make your room sound worse. So people said, okay, told you it doesn't work. We have to get back to the room tuning. But then the reality is that a measurement microphone sees the world different from a human being. So for a measurement mic, one measurement point, like a measurement microphone sees three different kind of frequency responses in three different points in your room. Whereas for a human being, your brain is actually quite a powerful DSP engine. As you probably know, it's actually kind of doing all sorts of psychoacoustical tricks on you. So what you're hearing is not what your brain makes you think you're hearing. So basically what the brain does is it's actually averaging sounds from all around you. It's kind of taking some sort of average from all the frequency responses around you, taking sounds reflecting from your body and from your face, and actually what you think you're hearing in terms of a frequency response is actually the average that your brain of the frequency response around you that the brain is computing for you. And that's basically the approach that we have taken when creating Sonarworks technology for room tuning, is that if you know the software, it's basically making a number of measurements around the sweet spot where you are sitting, and then calculating a smart average from all of those measurements, and thus actually arriving at a frequency response that makes much more sense for you as a human being than a single spot measurement microphone measurement does. All right?
Amazing. Just in the first few minutes here, you've touched on so much that I think we can almost unpack, and just to slow down for a second, I want to make sure that some of those things really have come through clearly. So you're saying that the human brain is doing the kind of averaging that you've essentially mimicked with Sonarworks. And the biggest problem that early on with some of these EQ solutions is they would only be able to measure a few points. And then when they do, they're doing some very primitive potential averaging between those. But I guess a big benefit, right, to Sonarworks would be then that under the hood, you're able to do many more calculations on many more points than you could do with one of these earlier systems.
Yes,
is that the general idea?
Exactly. The kind of the other unique thing that we have about the Sonarworks software is that with every measurement, we actually locate the microphone in the room acoustically. So, and that actually allows for two things. One, which are both important to achieving what we are doing. One is it actually makes sure that the users between different rooms and different use cases and different people actually running the software are actually repeating the same pattern and measuring the same spots around the sweet spot in the same manner. So it makes for an easy user interface that delivers kind of consistent application of the measurement process. And the other thing is that since the software locates the mic in the room, then it also kind of sees the measurements in context between each other. So it doesn't only see like a number of blind measurements that it doesn't really know where they came from. It actually sees those measurements in context. And once it does, then it can actually be more intelligent about how the average profile for that place in the room is calculated. And thus the result of Sonarworks calibration is considerably consistent between different users in different rooms, and we can actually talk about a standard reference sound that we're bringing about rather than just some improvement of a sound in this room or in that room. We're actually kind of getting consistent results. So the frequency response that you get after calibration with Sonarworks in one room will be very similar to a calibration kind of calibrated sound that you would be hearing in another room, and it will actually be quite similar to the frequency response that you would be hearing from a set of calibrated headphones. So we're actually establishing this reference sound platform that improves the workflow of people working across different locations, kind of recording music in different studios, and sometimes working on a headphone and sometimes working on a speaker. So we're actually kind of opening up a lot of opportunities and speeding up and improving a lot of workflows that were kind of harder to do kind of some time ago.
Right. Now, quick question for you. I'd imagine that how many measurements should you take around the sweet spot for ideal results? One answer is infinite, right? The more measurements you take, the better average you can get. But the other answer is as few as possible, because you want people to actually use this thing and have not take them 3 days to measure their room. So what have you found has been the good sweet spot for the number of measurements to take that makes it a kind of easy user experience while also getting enough measurement points for an average?
Yes, exactly. That's a very good point. What we have actually done, we've asked that question to ourselves quite a lot, obviously. We've ended up doing a research internally around this subject, and the 37 points that our software is currently measuring is basically the sweet spot that we have found. On one hand, obviously, the user wants to spend as little time as possible calibrating the room and as much time as possible actually making music, right? That's kind of what we're all in this for. But on the other hand, the more measurements you make, the more accurate it becomes. So we've found this sweet spot that basically 37 points seems to be the right amount. Kind of if you start taking more points, then the improved accuracy kind of starts really diminishing beyond that. And if you take less points, then kind of you're actually introducing too much inconsistencies between different measurements and different locations. So we've kind of thought about it and come up with this number as the pragmatic answer.
Great. And what is the end user experience like as far as how long it ends up taking them for taking 37 measurements? Is that taking half a day or how much time is someone setting aside? I already know the answer to that question.
So
the
the kind of frank answer to that is the kind of first time measurement would probably take something like 30 minutes, just because somebody has to, like the new user has to understand all the workflow of the software and set it up and everything. But basically, once you've been through it once, then every next measurement would be like 20 minutes tops, 15 minutes kind of the new kind of remeasurement cycle. So it's very quick.
Now, when would those remeasurements happen? Is that just when people are moving speakers or bringing new speakers in or adding new acoustic treatment? Is it those kind of milestone changes where you do remeasurements?
Definitely those kind of, as soon as you start changing something significant about your room that would influence the acoustics of the room, then definitely you have to remeasure it to kind of keep it on the level. But also kind of, even if you don't change anything about the room, I would actually recommend remeasuring the room like every second month or something like that, because sometimes the speakers kind of change something about the way they sound. Really kind of we've sometimes done these demo measurements to find out that, hey, like some speaker kind of tweeter has blown or something, some other kind of thing has happened that has gone unnoticed. But so every second month maybe kind of, it's fairly quick, so kind of remeasuring it once in a while to know you're still on the level is recommended.
Sure. So I guess it almost has a diagnostic capability as well, both for figuring out where problems are in your room and for figuring out if anything's gone wrong with your speakers. You'll get charted out the frequency response of each of these speakers. And one of the things I have noticed, people have said to me they've used the Sonarworks stuff and it helped because they had like this 12 dB bump or null at some low frequency point in their studio, which is not uncommon. They didn't even know it was there. But once they took the measurements, they say, oh my goodness, 120 hertz in my room is terrible or whatever it is. But then they do the Sonarworks and now not only has it corrected for it to a significant degree, in some cases, maybe not to zero, but to a significant degree. But then they know, all right, if I'm going to do additional acoustic treatment, here's the area that I need to focus on.
Yes.
And so that's a thing where it can be a diagnostic tool as well as a solution tool. And it's one of the things that I kind of like about the system.
Exactly. Kind of. We started off with me saying that actually we still recommend tuning the room to the best of your ability and budget kind of before applying Sonarworks on top of it. So just as you say, it is because of the measurement being quick and consistent in the method between the different rounds. It's actually very much a good guidance for you while tuning the room to kind of start off with measuring it with Sonarworks, kind of learn where the acoustical problems in your room are, and especially so in your sweet spot. Then try changing something about the room, remeasure it, and see if what you were aiming for got improved. Another big good application of this is if you have a sub in your system and then you need to align the sub with your satellite speakers, right? Then again, it's best if you actually align the sub by finding the right spot for it and kind of tuning all the knobs on the sub so that it fits as good as possible with your speakers, frequency response-wise. Again, Sonarworks can really kind of help you find that right tuning for the sub, because you can kind of measure it, see how it overlaps with the speakers and kind of where the problem is, then kind of try looking for a new spot of the sub, try finding the phasing of the sub so that it actually matches that of your speakers, remeasure, see if that improved. Once you're done kind of tuning your sub, then kind of still measure the whole thing with Sonarworks, and it actually helps the sub blend in with the speakers really well. So.
Right. This is interesting. Now, I have to a quick aside before I get to my next point. How long have you been doing this? How long have you been with Sonarworks?
Well, Sonarworks is now, I keep forgetting, but I think it's now 6 or 7 years, something like that.
Gotcha. And you're one of the co-founders, right? One of the two original founders. It's just interesting to hear how kind of passionate you are about this stuff and how thoughtful you are about it after doing it for so long. You don't seem to be any less excited about the possibilities, which I like. You know, you don't always find that. So one thing that you've touched on in your opening remarks in the beginning, and that I started to hint at too, is this idea of diminishing returns. And I've got to say that that is one of the things, just editorializing here for a second, that sold me on this solution. Is I really recommend, like I said, everyone, you put up some acoustic treatment. If you're in a bare room and you put up your first $1,000 of commercially purchased acoustic treatment, the difference can be staggering. You can probably get similar results spending $300 or $400 on DIY solutions if you want to put all the labor yourself. But once you've put in your first $1,000 or $1,500 or $2,000 worth of acoustic treatment, spending another $300 or $400 or $500 on acoustic treatment isn't necessarily going to give you another huge quantum leap, whereas spending $300 or $400 or $500 on a EQ solution could give you that quantum leap. So at a certain point, you're going to hit diminishing returns on acoustic treatment, where the next step is spending a ton more for tiny improvements. And the same is true with speakers. You're going to hit a point where your next improvements are going from a $2,000 set of speakers to a $7,000 pair of speakers, and then you have big improvements, but there's very tiny changes in between, whereas adding on some panels could then have a big improvement compared to adding on to speakers, or adding on EQ could have a big improvement compared to going up in speakers. So I think that's one of the things that I always want people to think about when treating the rooms is where do you already have the most diminishing returns, and where can you find now the biggest leaps for the smallest upgrade in price? So if you already have great room treatment and something like Sonarworks, rather than going from a $400 or $500 EQ solution to a $4,000 or $5,000 EQ solution, the idea is maybe upgrade your speakers. But if you already have a couple $1,000 set of speakers and some room treatment, the next obvious thing to do before you touch either of those to me would be EQ. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that's a valid way to kind of approach the problem?
I very much actually like the way you put it. So there are these diminishing returns, and then I would say exactly as you say, kind of invest a few thousand kind of in room treatment and invest kind of maybe 1,000 to a few thousand in your speakers, but kind of going beyond that in both of those categories kind of, in my experience, kind of quite quickly hits this diminishing return. Not to say that there is no benefit in investing like $10,000 or $20,000 in your room treatment, or investing kind of 10, 20,000 in your speakers. Kind of it brings some benefit, but definitely you're getting into this diminishing returns effect there. I would say kind of somewhere around 1,000 in the speakers, 1,000 in the room, then room tuning software, and then kind of go from there, kind of. But that's a very valid way to think about it. So I was just kind of in this context, I'm recalling one of the stories that when we're sometimes doing kind of live kind of demos of the software for some friends and people kind of around the world. So in one of those cases, we were demoing what Sonarworks can do for one producer of quite a famous band, actually. And we kind of did the room calibration, we showed the demo, and the guy went like, oh my God, guys, I was all the time kind of worried that my mixes are actually not translating so well from this room. It was actually a classic garage studio at a private home in LA. And kind of he was saying like, hey, I was actually worried that the mixes are not translating as well as I would want them to. So I was thinking that my $3,000 pair of speakers is probably not doing me justice and I need to upgrade them. So I was thinking that, hey, I should sell some of my kind of hardware gear that I have and that I'm not using that much. I should sell those speakers, kind of save up some more and get like a $10,000 pair worth of speakers. But oh my God, now you came along and I'm now hearing everything exactly as I wanted. So guys, you just saved me like $6,000 of worth of investment of trying to upgrade my speakers, and I've actually probably got better sound out of them than I would hoped for. So that's
If you put $10,000 speakers in a compromised environment, they're not going to perform that much better than a $3,000 pair of speakers in that compromised environment. One interesting thing you guys did on the Sonarworks blog, and I do have to say that Sonarworks is one of those companies like Isotope, like Universal Audio, like a few others that have a great blog just with great content of its own, you know, for a company doing a little bit of a media outlet thing. But one of those blog posts was you took, I can't remember, it was a half a dozen different speakers all in the same room and measured them all using Sonarworks. And the big takeaway was that the differences between all of those speakers at a variety of price points was so small compared to the difference between flat and the room that, you know, it was staggering. Like if you haven't taken care of that whole, you know, room / maybe EQ for the room environment, it almost doesn't matter which speakers that you have. Now, you know, the one caveat I'll give it to this is this was tested in a fairly untreated room. If you're in a fairly well-treated room, that gap is going to shrink and the differences between speakers become increasingly significant the better treated the room is. But in an untreated, any day of the week, I would rather have a set of $2,000 speakers in a well-treated room than a $20,000 set of speakers in a untreated room. You know, there's just absolutely no contest that you can get the most out of a $2,000 set of speakers, well-treated room with some EQ, versus $20,000 speakers in a gymnasium or a garage. If I painted that, obviously, then you know. But you'd be surprised just in bare walls how much that's going to compromise any super high-end set of speakers. The other thing that I want to say is we've been throwing out numbers here. You know, we're talking in the thousands, and not everyone listening to this is shopping in the thousands for speakers. I would still argue that a solution like Sonarworks may be valid for people who are getting a $300 to $600 pair of speakers. It may be one of those places to look. You have to remind me exactly what the retail price is for the different solutions. We'll get to that maybe a little later on. But the other thing that's possible is headphones. So you guys do headphone correction, trying to take pairs of headphones that are available off the shelf and then making them as close to neutral as possible. At what point how much do you recommend that people rely on headphones? How far from flat are they? And when you get them closer to flat, what kind of tasks do you find that they actually become valuable for?
All right. So first thing is actually kind of, again, when we started, and we started actually kind of when we started the company, and we were kind of started to look at the headphone frequency responses also quite early on. So that's like 6-7 years ago from now, right? So when we started, I actually kind of, I don't think I met anyone who thought that mixing on headphones is a good idea. Everybody was like, hey, no, that's kind of, that's a common knowledge that you don't mix on headphones. That's kind of a no-go. And we were still, hey, yeah, but okay, let's still try doing something about the headphones. And nowadays there is, I think, quite more acceptance. It's almost become kind of a public knowledge and an idea among the music creators that you can mix on headphones, depending on your setup and everything. So hopefully we've helped that come to life as Sonarworks as well. But first and foremost, the interesting question is, I would argue that nowadays when you think about how people listen to music, then I would say a 70% or kind of a considerable amount of kind of listening of music actually takes place on headphones, right? So in a way, what are speakers doing here, right? Kind of people consume music on headphones anyway, so why don't you start creating that music on headphones? But okay, there are reasons why speakers kind of make more sense, and things that you can hear on speakers that you can't hear so well on headphones. So that's just a side note. But then basically when we started off, then the kind of the stories that we were hearing when I was talking to mixing engineers about the experience of trying to mix on headphones was that, hey, yes, I thought like my kid was asleep, it was late at night, I didn't want to blast my speakers, so I tried mixing on headphones. Next day, I listened to what I mixed on speakers. I realized it's all crap. I kind of had to throw it out and start all over again. So no, I don't mix on headphones. So those kinds of stories were very common. Now, what we have done with the headphones is we've basically found a methodology for how to measure the frequency response of the headphone, and then how to tune the headphone so that it sounds, and this is quite an important angle. The question is, what do you calibrate the headphone to? Because if you calibrate the headphone to a technical flat, then it doesn't sound that good. And that's kind of also what some people have found, saying, hey, no, but that doesn't work. And the reason there is that when you listen to the speakers, then some of the sound that you think you're perceiving as sound is actually perceived by your body, especially in the bass frequency area. So when you're hearing speakers, you're actually not only hearing with your ears, you're also hearing with your body, and that your brain then sums up and interprets as sound. So there is a translation curve from a kind of a speaker flat to a headphone flat. So to make headphones sound the same as a flat sounding speakers to you, it's not just kind of technically calibrating them towards flat. Anyway, as Sonarworks, kind of what we do is we make...
Not in any way. I want more detail on that. If you give me just a quick second, just in broad terms, how should the EQ curve of headphones be different than flat to sound flat to the human ear? You don't have to give away any, trade secrets and exact proportions, but just in broad terms, can you give us
in broad terms,
sense
kind of, I wouldn't be able to give away any detailed stuff over a podcast format anyway. But,
sure, yeah.
I draw with my hand, but but the point is that kind of when you're hearing music coming from or sound coming from your speakers, then your body is actually perceiving some of the bass with your body and then interpreting that as you hearing sound. If you are listening to the speakers, then kind of the measured frequency response is more kind of bass lean in a way. The measurement mic sees it kind of as a more bass lean thing than what you're actually interpreting in your brain. So bottom line, we make headphones sound frequency response-wise very similar to a pair of calibrated speakers. So that actually when you work on Sonarworks calibrated pair of headphones, then you're actually, the translation between speakers and headphones happens really smoothly. You can work on headphones and then continue working on speakers. So we have our clients saying, hey, I'm flying all the time, so hey, this enables me to work on the plane. Or sometimes I'm at a hotel situation and I want to do some work quickly, and this actually enables me to do some work that I can trust. Or sometimes it's these late night situations when you can't go loud, especially in the big cities with kind of sensitive neighbors behind your walls and stuff like that. So this actually now, kind of when you calibrate the headphones, it actually enables quite many use cases and making the lives of music creators way easier than they were before.
Absolutely. I just want to share a story on this note. There is a Grammy-nominated, platinum-selling producer, engineer, mixer guy who I know, who I cannot reveal his name because he told me in confidence, don't tell anyone that I'm the one who told this to you, but he's living in New York City, working at a variety of fancy studios. But for a lot of his mixing projects, he was needing to do them, to kind of cut costs, be competitive today, do them in more of a home studio environment. And he's living there in New York City, where they don't have the luxury of having, the detached garage that they build into their studio. So rather than booking out nice studios for all of these sessions, he would do a lot of his mixing on a pair of headphones using Sonarworks at his kitchen table while watching his kid. And then when he finished mixing, he would send them off to his mastering engineer, who was similarly doing his mastering. I hadn't heard of this ever before, on headphones. And then they would end up giving these final results to the clients. The clients say, great, sounds beautiful, sold. And then, they'd go off and publish these, and these would become major label releases in some cases, or, really kind of high value indie releases in other cases. And it was amazing to me. It's the first that I had heard of it. And he's like, I couldn't have done that in the days before Sonarworks. He has since now moved to another place where he has a studio in his house, and he's doing more of his mixing on speakers again. But now he's taking really seriously headphones as a reference, because like you said, so many end listeners today are doing serious listening on headphones. We're all so atomized. Everyone's traveling on subways, or, have their earbuds in on a walk or whatever it is, that is so much of the listening experience that you want to know how your mixes translate to that experience. And now being able to make critical listening decisions on headphones is huge, even if you're not primarily mixing on them. I would say that the two problems I've had with both mixing and trying to do mastering on headphones is, one, like you said, the low frequency response. So much of low frequency that you hear from speakers is what you're hearing from in here, your chest cavity, your body. I have actually a secret pair of headphones, my blue Mixify headphones. These are some of the first headphones I've ever tried that have bass response, where you actually feel the low end, and there's useful information below, say, 60 and 70 hertz, just straight out of the box before putting any treatment on it. But that's extremely unusual. And then the other big problem, and you'll see it a lot if you go to Sonarworks website, look at some of their measurements of microphones before and after. One of the biggest things you'll find is, yes, headphones. What did I say? I said microphones, goodness. You guys will have to get into the microphone correction business one day. That'll be another podcast. But you can go on the Sonarworks website and then find their measurements of all these different headphones, and you'll see that often the high frequencies also are kind of crazy. Like there'll be big peaks or big dips, and that's what's giving some of them their character. Like you might find a pair of headphones that's down several dB at 8K and up several dB at 10K, or they have, a few dB up at 3K and then a big, dip at 7K. And that mid to high balance is rarely very flat. Very often you can find fairly neutral mid-range, but just weird stuff happening in the high end. And then, of course, you don't have that feeling in the low end. So I guess the two biggest things you're able to do is to kind of bring that mid-frequency and high frequency into balance. So it's not so squiggly and it's just more straight. And then to a degree, you're amplifying the low end to get it feeling a little bit more like speakers would. Is that a fair way to say what's happening?
I think the objective with headphones is basically the same objective that we have with the speakers. You just mentioned headphones having a character, and that kind of arising from the frequency response curve of that headphone, right? But when you are, we'll get to that probably a little later in the conversation, but there is this music creation context where you can use speakers and headphones, and there is a music listening context where you can use speakers and headphones, right? So in the music, and those contexts are actually different for what you want out of a headphone and what you want out of a speaker. So for a creation context, what we have found and what our users have found is that what you actually want is as neutral sound as possible. You really want kind of the speaker or the headphone not to add anything to the track that you're creating, and you want nothing to be subtracted from the track that you're creating.
Now, this is obvious to some of us, but why? Why is that important, and why is that the goal?
Bottom line, it ensures better translation. So we have literally kind of every day somebody writing to our support, or when we are at NAMM show, somebody coming over to our booth just to say, thank you guys, you've changed my life. Kind of before I was like making 10 cycles back and forth to the car to kind of make mix notes, come back, try to kind of improve my mix, or I was sending it off to some sort of supervisor or client and then making many cycles of trying to figure out what's wrong with the track. And now since I started using Sonarworks, I've actually now I'm making just one cycle to the car, or I'm getting no comments from my client, and everybody just likes the stuff that I'm making. So bottom line, it improves translation. You're getting to the result that you need way quicker, and that kind of tremendously improves your workflow. You don't have to second guess. You don't have to run these processes in your head that try to compensate for the things that you think your speakers are doing. So you can just go all in and make the best track that you can, and stop worrying about whether your speakers are adding or subtracting anything from it. If you get deeper into it, then there are two things. One is a flat sound, one of the nasty things that goes on when the curves have like dips or peaks is that there is this thing called a masking effect. So if there is a peak, say at like 300 hertz, or a dip at 2000 hertz or whatever, then your brain again plays tricks on you. It zooms in on those anomalies in the frequency response and pays attention to that. And then the frequencies that are near those dips or peaks, you're actually missing out on. Your brain just your ears hear it, but your brain skips the interpretation of that, because it's going for the louder things in the sound, paying more attention to that. So when you have these dips and peaks, you end up missing stuff that is there in the track, but so that you're not hearing, and then that you're trying to clean up as you hear it on different systems. And when you even out those dips and peaks, then you're actually hearing most detail out of the track, and you can pay attention to all of that. And then also just because of how different all the systems out there actually sound. And I mean, if you plot the frequency responses of all the headphones that we have measured, which is now like over 300, then you're basically just getting an even cloud of stuff. There is no overall pattern to it. So the flat sound also ends up being the best average of all those systems out there. So it's your best shot at creating something that will sound okay on most of the systems out there.
Right.
But
so all the consumer systems out there they're all flawed, but they're all flawed in such different ways. And when you put them all together, the average of the average bad system is actually a flat system when you're comparing them all together. That's fascinating.
So getting back to your question about the headphones, so we're actually trying to remove all of what you call character from the headphones, in the sense that we're trying to get the headphone to sound as close to a flat sounding speakers in a well-tuned room sound. And then you actually, when creating music, I would argue you don't really want any character to the headphone. You actually want it to be neutral. You want character to be the thing that you add to your music, but you don't want to perceive it through some other character of a headphone. You actually want it to be neutral. When you get to listening to music, then it's a different story. But when you're creating music, then you actually want this neutral sound and
I 100% agree. Yeah. And if there's one takeaway that I can give people who haven't heard this before, is that if you get headphones that really speak to your biases, say you love big boom and bass, so you get headphones or speakers with big boom and bass, then all of your mixes are going to come back without big boom and bass, because you're not putting any into your system, because you're hearing that through your speakers or headphones. So to a degree, your mixes will always sound like, and the things you create will always sound like the inverse of your speakers. So if you get really flat speakers, then you don't have to worry about that. But if you're getting things that you love the sound of, you might not love the sound of your mixes, because you're not doing the things to amp up those things that you love.
That's exactly the point. When you're creating the music, then you actually have these million tools in front of you in your DAW that basically you can do anything you want, and you can really implement your vision of what the song should sound like. If you believe in mad amounts of bass, then go ahead, you can put it in the track. That's what you should do, right? And if you hate that, then you shouldn't do it. But you should put all of that vision, all of the sound that you're passionate about, you should put it in the track, rather than allow your headphones to create it for you, because then it's not in your track, then it's in your headphones. So, right?
Now, yes, absolutely. Now, this is a great segue into something else. Sonarworks, I will set up by saying they're a very successful company. They've done a lot of successful things. Martins Popelis has done a lot of great things. Sonarworks has had one public failure to date in the sense that you tried to take this idea of flat sound and deliver it to consumers with something called TrueFi. Yep. Now you can hear in your own headphones at home the same flat sound that they heard in the studio. And people didn't really like it because the end consumers don't like the sound of flat. They like the sound of hyped in the way that they like things being hyped. So it's almost like flat isn't the most fun thing to listen to. As creators, we almost want to suffer with a flat sound, so we have to work extra hard to make things sound hyped up for the end listener. But when it comes to being an end listener, people do want to listen on something that's fun and that's hyped in the way that tickles them, right? Some people are tickled by extra brightness. Some people are tickled by extra bottom end. What sounds great to me might not be what sounds great to you. For instance, just a quick example, I like the sound of kind of dark, mellow, woody, full sounding guitars. And if I buy an acoustic guitar, I like a Martin acoustic guitar. They sound full and rich to me. And that sounds classy to me and expensive and nice. To other people, when they hear that kind of guitar, they think it sounds dull and boxy. They really like a Taylor acoustic guitar that's bright and chimey. And to them, that sounds like an expensive, well-appointed guitar. And headphones are the same way. You might like extra sparkle. I might like extra bottom. And you guys have kind of started to do something for consumers that takes that into account. So you've kind of thrown away this TrueFi project, right, where we're delivering flat sound to consumers. And you've replaced it with something that I tried out at NAMM that was a really interesting, fun, like 5-minute experience to tailor my own sound for my headphones. Can you tell us a little bit about this project that you're doing kind of on the consumer end now?
Sure. That's, I think, the kind of, most exciting thing we're now working at Sonarworks at the moment. Short story kind of the TrueFi history is we started off with doing this headphone and speaker calibration software for the studios, right? And then it apparently did some good for music creators and we became fairly successful with the product. And we said like, hey, yes, now we're making good sound for the studios, but then as soon as we say translation, right? But what translation really means is everybody is still hearing it through different headphones, through different speakers. So everybody out there is still hearing a different version of it. They're kind of getting this random EQ between your music and themselves by buying the headphones. So everything still sounds different out there. And so translation kind of means that it sounds okay on everything. It doesn't really nothing terrible kind of pops out on anything, but it's still kind of different. So we were saying, hey, okay, now when we have this technology and we can apparently tame the sound on the creator end, why don't we actually solve the consumer end of the equation as well? Why don't we bring out the studio sound to the consumers? And why don't we kind of calibrate the world? And then what you create in the studio will be exactly what the end user hears, and it will be even more amazing than what it is now when you can calibrate your studio. So we created, out of this idea, we created the product that we called TrueFi, and that was going with the promise of basically, hey, kind of hear studio sound on your headphones, saying to the end listener, hey, hear it as it was created in the studio. And to be honest, we quite early on understood that the flat sound is not really what's going to fly with the end listener. They want it a little bit hyped. So we kind of put a little more excitement into the target curve. It was not the technical flat that you get out of our studio product. It was a little more hyped version of it. But bottom line, that product still didn't fly with the end user because not enough people really liked the sound. So in a way, the TrueFi product failed because of that. And that wasn't the kind of brightest moment in our history, but we kind of said, okay, let's get to
it. It was a good idea, though.
Yes, exactly.
You were giving people what they should want,
exactly.
Right? And that's sometimes what a lot of us in audio get into is like, this is what you should want. But to a degree, you have to say, okay, instead of delivering what you should want, what is it you really want? And that's how you really satisfy people.
So we kind of we suffered this crash with TrueFi, and then that's exactly the question that we asked ourselves after, saying, okay, so not enough people liked what they should like, right? So let's ask them, what do they really like? And we ended up actually doing the biggest ever consumer sound preference research, I think, in the history of audio in the history of audio technology. We now have a research that has like close to 40,000 people who have participated in it, to whom we have asked like, hey, so what sound do you like? So I think by now we have quite a deep insight into that subject. And the bottom line is that everybody likes something else. Kind of our sound preferences seem to be genuinely different. Like some people like to hear a lot of bass, some people hate it, some people like high frequency treble, some people hate it. Our hearing is different and it actually changes with age. So all of those things combined end up in a place where people actually like different sounds, kind of genuinely. If you now, by the research, if you take one single best target curve that either we can come up with as Sonarworks or as a single headphone company can come up with, kind of if they do the best job possible on a particular model of a headphone, then the single target curve will be the best possible sound for no more than 17% of the population,
wow.
which is quite crazy if you think about it. On the other hand, kind of, I mean, what changed in my head, at least after this research, was that before I was kind of still living in this paradigm that the holy grail of sound exists, right? If only some manufacturer would kind of make this ultimate headphone next CES, or some speaker manufacturer would create the best speaker kind of for next NAMM or whatever, then kind of the world would recognize that, lock in onto that product and live happily ever after. But that kind of keeps on not happening, and instead you keep on seeing these religion wars about, is Beats sound good, or kind of should we kind of forbid people listening to it, or is Sennheiser good sound, or is some other company?
The answer to that ultimately is Beats legitimately sounds great to some people.
Exactly.
And to other people, legitimately sounds terrible.
Exactly.
And there's that old saying, there's no arguing about taste. Yeah. This is a taste-based question. And I just want to repeat that statistic you threw out there. You said that no more than 17% of the people, like the most popular curve was liked by the most by only 17% of the people.
Yes. So the kind of single best target curve that we can come up with was going to be the best possible sound for no more than 17%. Whereas now, around this insight, we have now built this product that's called SoundID. We've actually kind of now launched an application on the App Store, and we're going to stay tuned. Kind of pretty soon, we're going to come with more SoundID products. But bottom line now, we've created this SoundID, which is a technology and an application that uses machine learning algorithms to actually find the best possible sound for each individual. And with that approach, kind of within actually kind of less than 2 minutes, anyone can find him or herself a target curve. And after that process, we now have close to 80% of people who say, hey, yes, I actually like this sound better than whatever original sound there was of my headphone. So if you carry this 80% conversion of sorts, right, to the 17% that you have with a single kind of fixed sound, then it's quite a significant improvement. And kind of how I think about it is like, I like this analogy kind of with painting, right? So if you're a painter, then also you have this creation context and you have the listening or kind of enjoyment context. So when you're creating your painting, you probably want like a neutral white light that's kind of color temperature neutral, so that when you're painting your sunset, you actually kind of know exactly what type of red tone you're putting into it. But then when you've done painting and you're actually kind of bringing that painting home, then and you put it by your fireplace, then you might, as an end kind of consumer of that art, you might want some mood lighting in your room. And then some people might want it more red, some people might like it white, some people might want some tint of green to kind of shine in their room when they're listening to the music. So I think the same thing is actually true about sound. When you're creating sound, you actually want this neutrality to the sound, to the kind of monitoring. You don't want any kind of coloration to happen with your speakers or your headphones. But then when you've done creating and you're actually into enjoying the music, then it's a very fair question to ask, so how do you personally enjoy listening to your music? And currently, when you take end listeners as a group, then most of them don't understand too much about sound, so they actually end up putting this random EQ in form of their headphones or in form of their speakers, kind of in between your music and themselves, and they might like it, but most probably they're not finding the best possible EQ for themselves. They just kind of end up with something. And then when you put it through this process of SoundID, and when we find this personal sound preference for each end user, then we make sure that they're actually hearing your music with the best possible coloration for themselves. So that kind of maximizes the chance that they will actually like your music. That kind of maximizes the chance that you will emotionally engage with them through the music, because they will hear it in the way that they most like to hear sound.
Right. But now that SoundID, just to be clear, you're not doing a different SoundID for each different track. So it's not like we measure the sound that the person really loves and then we're going to apply that to each track. It's like we're applying it overall. Your headphones now have a new curve that's going to speak to you the most. So this is interesting. This is a great idea, because not everyone, most consumers don't shop for headphones the way I shop for headphones. The way I shop for headphones is I go in and I try out 10 different pairs of headphones and I say, these 5 are not going to do it. These 5 are the ones I'm going to compare between. Then I compare between all of those and I say, ooh, it's either this one or this one. And then I pick the one that I like most, because I'm a nerd about sound. Most people aren't nerds about sound. The way most people select headphones is they get what their friends recommended to them. They get what seemed like the best reviewed brand. They pick the ones that seem the most stylish. Or maybe they tried on a pair of headphones one time and said, oh, this is a different experience than all other headphones. Those are the ones I have to get. But what you're able to do is whatever headphones they ended up with, whether it's a pair of headphones that suits them or not, they go through this app. And for those of you guys who haven't done it, is the SoundID app available online?
Yes, it's on the App Store.
So just look up SoundID, or if I type in Sonarworks into the App Store, it'll come up.
Will work.
Okay, you download this app. Super fun to use. You plug in your headphones, regardless of what kind of headphones you're on, and you get to choose 5 different tracks. It's an acoustic track, or a rock track, or a hip hop track, or a dance track. You pick the track you want to use, and then it asks you a series of questions. It's almost like going to an audio optometrist, right? Better like this, better like this. And you choose which one you like. Better like this, better like this. You choose which one you like. Better like this, better like this. And then at the end, after all of those decisions, just like going to the eye doctor, it says, here's your audio prescription. This is the curve that best suits all of those questions you answered. And when it spit out mine, I'm like, that's exactly the curve I would have expected. I believe, if I remember correctly, there was a slight lift up in the low end and there's a slight dip down in the upper mids. I like a kind of smoother, fuller bodied sound. And I was like, this app, it knows me. And I was astonished by that process. Like, that's exactly what I would have guessed for me. And some of my favorite headphones, the Focal Clears, the Clear Professionals, have the same dip. And it's one of the reasons I like them so much. They have the same kind of high, mid-range, low, high-end dip in them that gives them that smooth character. And that was the exact thing that the app spit back at me. So it was correct. It knew me. It knew my biases. So it was a fun experience. So for those of you listening, just download it now. Just type in Sonarworks or type in SoundID into your app thingy and try it out. And you could take headphones potentially that you hate the sound of. Like, I hate the sound of Sony MDR 7506s, one of the most popular headphones ever made. To me, they're super brash, super annoying. But theoretically, you could plug in those headphones, and then SoundID is going to kind of first take it to neutral, but then take it beyond neutral and say, instead of just bringing down the high end, because these are so bright, we're going to bring down the high end. And then because you like things a little dark, we're going to bring it down a little bit more in these select spots so that no matter what, I end up with the curve that works right for me. So it's a really fun process. I could see consumers who are really into sound getting into that. And it's just going to create the sound that speaks most to their biases, most to their personal taste. So it's a fun process. And if you haven't tried it, I think you should.
Yes. I like it. I like
that
the
was
way
really
you put
a
it.
question. Who is interviewing who now? I do talk a lot in these podcasts. It's a little bit more a little more Joe Rogan podcast than straight interview podcast because I'm a loudmouth. The last thing I do want to challenge you slightly on, I'm going to be slightly challenging, and then I'm going to ask you another question that I think is going to be good for our audio nerd friends. So there's 2 big questions I want to get you that I think people want to stick around for. Okay, so 1, this is a statement, less than a question, but this is what I'm going to push back. You said that for music creation, the best thing to do is to have neutral sound. I could not agree more, but with a little bit of exception. I'm going to refine that slightly to say that if you are mastering, absolutely you want the closest to neutral sound. If you're mixing, you want the closest to neutral sound. If you're recording, you want the closest to neutral sound. And arguably, when you're producing, getting the initial sounds together, I guess that's recording, you want the most neutral sound. But if you are someone you're like in the songwriting process or the demoing process, and you're in the like inspirational content creation process where it's not about getting the final sound, but it's about getting the first idea, then in that context, I could see an argument for wanting the things that sound hyped up and inspiring to you. And this is a trick that, people will play to a degree on musicians. Like the singer is singing on headphones. And what we're giving the singer is not her flat neutral voice. We're giving her a little bit of EQ, a little bit of compression, a little bit of reverb and delay. Even if that's not the final EQ, compression, reverb, delay, we're hyping her up a little bit. We're giving her a kind of bias sound that's inspiring her. And I could see if you're sitting down with an acoustic guitar or electric guitar and you have headphones on and you're hearing back the ideas you're sketching out, that in that context, having something that sounds really fun could be just as good or better than having something that's flat. But whenever it comes down to making decisions that are going to be final for the end consumer, then to me, flat inarguably makes the most sense. So that's my tiny bit of pushback. Counter me. Tell me I'm wrong, or tell me I'm right. That works too.
It's an interesting angle that you're bringing up. I was kind of, there is something to it. I'm now thinking kind of, if you are the mixing engineer who knows what you're doing, and then there is the singer whom you want to be hyped up to be best performing, then I guess what you're saying is true. Kind of, you have to do whatever to get the sound that you want out of that person, right? Whereas if you're actually a electrical guitarist and you're kind of recording your own track, then arguably you want the excitement, but you actually want that excitement to end up being in your track, right? So you want this kind of exciting music to come out of your guitar, but if your headphones are sort of lying to you and kind of making it better than you're actually recording, then you're going to record it and then end up being disappointed. So in a way, you want that exciting sound, but you want it to come from the guitar and whatever kind of plugin or hardware effects you have between your guitar and your computer, but you don't want it so much from your headphones. That would just be kind of lying to you in a way, right?
Absolutely. I guess the subtle distinction I'm making is between the demoing / songwriting process and the recording / mixing process. And more today, those things are blended, where people are creating their initial sketches and they just turn that into the final product. So in that context, flat from day one makes sense. But when you are in a situation where there's a separation between the sketching demo processing and the creating final stuff for final listener process, I guess that's the potential separation I'm making. But I
would still actually
kind of splitting hairs at this point.
I tend to agree, but I would still argue that kind of as much as possible, I would try to get that excitement that you're looking for to come from the actual kind of track and the actual microphone and the actual effects that you put on the track, rather than kind of seek that excitement to come from your headphones.
That's a great point. Amp it up even more on your side. And if it sounds super amped on neutral, then it's just going to sound even more amped to the end listener who's listening not neutral. So that's a good point. That's a good point. Okay. Last big question I wanted to ask you, getting back to more the kind of practitioner end, the people who are in the studio making these recordings, making these mixes, is with the ability to really flatten out speakers as far as frequency response goes, so much that the relatively small differences in frequency response between speakers can be kind of smoothed out by something like Sonarworks, then what are the remaining attributes of speakers that we should care about when it comes to selecting sound? If we're no longer selecting our favorite speakers because they're closer to flat or they're brighter, we're bringing them all practically to zero, ideally, with Sonarworks. So what are those attributes where we should be shopping on if it's not frequency response when it comes to speakers?
I mean, kind of, if you talk from a physics point of view, right, then frequency response is just one of the parameters that describe the sound of the headphones. As you've probably kind of learned kind of in our experience, and there are other experts who are confirming it, frequency response is actually the single most important parameter of a speaker. I would say it's like 80%. If you don't get the frequency response, then the other parameters probably don't really matter. If you're kind of fix the frequency response, then you can actually start talking about those parameters.
And you guys are essentially coming as close as you can as taking that most important parameter and almost throwing it away. Not 100%, but pretty close to throwing it away or reducing it from being the 80% most important thing down in the tier. So what are those remaining parameters?
I mean, there is a number of those. I don't know how technical you want to go, but kind of there are things like...
Anyone who's listened this long is a nerd, so let's get technical.
There are things like harmonic distortion. There are things like a phase response of the speaker. There are things like the spatial kind of frequency response dispersion, kind of, or the spatial kind of distribution of the sound coming out of the speaker. So there are all those things where you can still get nerdy about it and where you can compare kind of a cheap pair of speakers to an expensive kind of pair of speakers, and then start kind of getting deeper into those different angles of sound. So all of those things exist there, kind of, especially actually a thing like a phase response of a speaker is something that's kind of can only be fixed on the manufacturer level. Kind of it has to kind of to tune the phase response of the speaker. You really have to get below the crossover kind of level. If it's called a multiple driver speaker, then to kind of really clean up the phase response, you can't really fix the speaker as the whole system. Kind of too many things are happening kind of at the crossover level. So kind of
yeah, and what you're talking about there is whether, if you have a two-driver speaker, conventional two-driver speaker, whether the tweeter and the woofer are as close to being in phase as possible
at and
every frequency that they both reproduce together.
And the kind of distortion that the crossover is inevitably introducing to the system, kind of as it's kind of then kind of cutting the sound for tweeter and for the main driver.
Sure. I will offer, I think, the things that I listen for in this context when frequency response is not the most important thing. They would be, one, this is one of the reasons I've become so into multi-driver speakers. Ever since I started working on more than two-way speakers, it's hard for me to go back to two-way speakers. Because one of the things that happens with two-way speakers is that the frequency response will actually kind of change depending on how loud you're driving them, and depending on how much low frequency content there is in the material. So a conventional two-way speaker, say you have a 6 or 8 inch woofer and then this tiny, 1 inch-ish tweeter. When that big woofer has to handle everything from 50 hertz to 2000 hertz or 50 hertz to 4000 hertz or whatever the crossover is, and you start throwing a lot of energy at 80 hertz and 100 hertz and 50 hertz into that driver, it becomes less good at reproducing 500 hertz and 1000 hertz. Like it just, so much of the movement is to get that, the excursion is to get those low frequencies moving, that what happens is those mid-range frequencies start to get more compressed, and it's a non-linear response. So that when you're listening to, a Dr. Dre track and there's boom and bass and you've got it cranked up, your mid-range is softened and lessened compared to when you're listening to some other track that doesn't have a ton of bass or you're not listening as loud. So that's one of the big things for me, is that for me, a multi-speaker, multi-driver design, now I have one speaker that's only taking care of up to, say, 500 hertz, and a new one is taking over from 500 hertz to 5,000. And now this little tweeter, all it has to do is the stuff it's really good at above 5,000, or whatever those crossovers might be. I'm just throwing out some numbers. And now each of those is pretty efficient. It's not trying to do too much work, so you don't have those frequencies that each driver is less efficient at driving being subdued and essentially compressed. And when I talk about the transient responsive speaker, some people get annoyed at me for saying transient responsive speakers. I had a couple YouTube comments that you shouldn't use that term because this, that, and the other thing. But that's what I think about, is that, and it's also nonlinear in the sense that that frequency that can't be reproduced well. It's the initial transient of it that can't be reproduced as well. So the transient is there. It's just not as amplified as it would otherwise be. So you almost get this compression of the peaks at those frequencies. So I hope I'm not getting weirdly too technical, but I've become very passionate about getting to more than 2 speaker driver designs for critical mixing and mastering applications. And it's because you'll get that more linear response. And I imagine it would pair even better with something like Sonarworks, where you've done this thing to make sure you have a great frequency response in a particular area, sweet spot of your room, but you've only done it at mostly one particular level. And that frequency response can now change with that 2-driver design depending on what you're feeding. But if you're looking at multi-driver designs now, then all of a sudden you can get even more out of the flatness of Sonarworks. Wow, that was a longer rant than I intended it to be. But does any of that make sense to you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's kind of, I don't think there's ultimately the perfect answer, right? Because if you go to a 3-driver speaker, then kind of you get less of a job for each of the drivers to do. On the other hand, you have one more crossover that then has to match 2 more drivers, and that introduces some other troubles there. So it's kind of, I mean, there's always some imperfection in the sound, kind of as much as we're seeking the holy grail, but sure, kind of, yes.
There's more ways for it to go wrong, and I think you see that reflected in the price of multi-driver speaker designs. It's like, oh, you already have a speaker. We're just adding another tiny speaker to it. Why should it cost that much more? But they cost a lot more because, like you said, there's so many more things that can go wrong. The other thing that you touched on that I think is super important is, like you said, the dispersion. And that's what people who are getting into testing speakers for the first time maybe don't listen for, is how wide is the sweet spot, in a sense. The speakers can contribute to that. And how detailed can you pick out things in the stereo spectrum? And just cueing people to listen for that. How precisely can you pinpoint things? Now listen to 3 different sets of speakers. And I don't think that EQ correction is going to fix that all the way. That's one of those things where, to a degree, the physical design is going to have still a large impact, even after EQ correction, in how minutely you can pinpoint things.
To add to that, actually, there is some degree to which a calibration of the speakers by software can actually help the stereo imaging.
Absolutely.
And it's actually, no matter how good your room is built, there are still going to be some differences in it. It's not going to be perfectly symmetrical. And then you will actually have frequency response differences between the left and the right channel. Now, when you calibrate those speakers, you actually are bringing them way closer to each other frequency response-wise. And psychoacoustically, we've found that that actually plays quite big of a role in terms of how well you are perceiving the stereo imaging. So it kind of becomes more accurate and more defined when you bring the frequency response of the speakers closer to each other.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. And I would imagine, so we've touched on the width and the precision in the stereo field. We've touched on the idea of the phase coherence between the drivers of that speaker, and we've touched on kind of the linearity of the speaker. I think one additional thing, and this is related to linearity, but would be total harmonic distortion. Does your speaker have enough power for your needs where it's not, crapping out and distorting? And distortion in speakers can be subtle. It's not like you're going to hear crackling. It's like you're going to hear saturation.
I mean, if you take really small speakers and push them really hard, I mean, you can get there.
That's true. I would say that most professional speakers are going to have power handlings where they'll handle at least 100 dB SPL or more, 115, to the point where it's like, if you max them out, it's going to hurt. But they're not all equally linear. When you're just because 2 speakers can both handle 105 dB SPL doesn't mean they're both going to sound equally clean at 90 dB SPL, and that's I guess another factor.
Yes, very much true. So sure, I mean, as we covered before, kind of by all means get the best speakers possible. At some price point, there is going to be diminishing returns on extra investment. But kind of even if you go really expensive speakers, then kind of a thing like Sonarworks will actually. I really liked how one friend put it. It maximizes your ability to kind of experience the investment that you've made in the speakers. It kind of makes sure that you're getting best out of your investment in the speakers, because it's kind of removing some things that stand between you and the speakers. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I just do want to give one more pitch one more time, that a lot of people who I know who have really enjoyed Sonarworks are not just people who have $1,000 and $2,000 speakers. They're people who have $100 headphones, and then they get the
headphone software is $99. If you want the full package for the speakers and the headphones, then it's $299. But so we're
gotcha. Yeah. So $100 to correct your headphones, and then $300 to correct your whole room. And does that include the measurement mic? That package?
$300 includes the measurement mic. Yeah.
And then you have like another package that's I think around $500 or $600 where you get like a pair of nice, fancy, high-end headphones.
Yes. So with the headphones, we have 2 modes of headphone calibration. One is what we call the average calibration, meaning we take that particular headphone model, we measure a number of those of pairs from that particular model, and there is usually some difference between pair to pair of the particular model. So we take an average of that profile, and then kind of we create these average profiles for headphone models. That's what you get with the software when you buy it, and then you can use it kind of right out of the box, kind of as soon as you install it in the computer. But then we're also doing individual calibration of the headphones, meaning we take a particular pair of a headphone, we actually put an ID sticker on it, and then we calibrate that particular pair of a headphone, and then it also it's then as accurate as it gets, and it also kind of does the left and right kind of stereo calibration of that particular pair. So that's the best thing you can get out of a particular headphone. So there is also, you can buy the individually calibrated headphones separately in our store, but you can also get it in a package with the software if you want to go all in.
So for $100, you are getting something 300 different mic models. Any one of those that you might own, we're taking the average of all of those mic models and giving you flat. Headphone, why do I keep on saying that? Because I keep on associating you guys with measurement mics.
Mic
That's
modeling is kind of the new kind of popular stuff, right?
Yes, there's at least 3 big products in that now: the Slate and the Antelope and the Townsend. But so for headphones, the $100, you get any one of 300 different models. If you own those, it'll calibrate you for the average of that model. But the ones that you guys sell directly is the calibrate for that specific model.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes.
So getting back to my original thing is that a lot of the people who I have heard who have had great benefits with your stuff aren't just people who own $1,000 and $2,000 and up speakers. They're people who own $100 and $200 pairs of headphones who got the software and said, wow, that changed my life. And it's also people potentially who have a set of $600 and $700 speakers that they really like, and they aren't going to be the kinds of people who are spending $1,000 or $2,000 on room treatment. Maybe they're putting out a few $100s in materials and doing some of their DIY, and then they're doing another few $100s to get the most out of that, $500 or $600 set of speakers. So there is a way potentially to hack getting closer to a $2,000 speaker in a treated room sound by less expensive speakers, doing some DIY yourself, and then adding on the EQ correction, where you can start to get really competitive, serious by just putting a little bit more elbow grease and kind of hacking the system rather than throwing all of your money at speakers. So that works for some people as well.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
Again, I'm still an advocate for get the best speakers in your budget, but have your budget include room in your budget for acoustic treatment and EQ correction. So don't think, I have $1,000 for speakers, let me buy speakers. Think, I have $1,000 for monitoring. How am I going to allocate that between speakers, room treatment, and EQ? And I would say the same thing if you have a $7,000 speaker budget. Don't say you have a $7,000 speaker budget. Say you have a $7,000 budget for monitoring. And how are you going to take those $7,000 and allocate them between your speakers, your EQ, and your room? And that's my thoughts and approach on it.
That's a very good way to put it. I agree to that 100%.
Gotcha. Well, Martins, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for giving you so much of your time and so late in the day over there in Latvia. There's so much more I feel like I could ask you. I hope this doesn't come across as me just completely shilling for Martins products. I do like Martins products, but I think this is just an important part of modern music production that you have to understand, because it's becoming the norm, and so many of the people you're out there competing with or collaborating with are using solutions like this, and you want to figure out why they're using solutions like this and whether you should be using them too. And I think we've gone over some of the arguments in favor of it. I can't think, honestly, of that many arguments not in favor of it. The only argument I could think that would not be in favor of it is if you're just thinking that EQ treatment is going to be the magic bullet, and so I'm just going to get a $100 set of speakers and put them in an untreated room, and the speaker correction will do everything. That's not what Martins recommends, and that's not what I recommend. But assuming that you're not going that far off the deep end, I can't think of any major cons personally. So I appreciate you being on this show. I appreciate your kind of passion and insight into the process. Thanks, Martin, so much for hanging out with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I hope this was interesting. So, yeah.
Great. All right, a few final words for you guys. I've got some free stuff for you. If you haven't checked it out yet, I've got a free mixing workshop that you can check out called The 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers. And it is about those common threads that I've found in the past decade plus of studying the best producers and engineers out there. Check that out. It's a free workshop. You can get it at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. If you're interested in learning a lot more about mastering, I've got a free video workshop for you on that called Mastering 101. You can check that out at sonicscoop.com/mastering101. I'll put links down there in the show notes. Also, a big thanks to this week's sponsors, who are Focusrite. I'm speaking right now through a lovely Focusrite claret interface. They make amazing bang for the buck stuff, all the way from their super entry-level Scarlett series up to the RedNet series. And big thanks to Soundtoys, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning, making some of my favorite effects plugins in the known universe. The entire bundle, I think it only sets you back like $500, and it has a ton of creative tools that are just a lot of fun to work on. Try out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com. Last, certainly not least, Eventide. Eventide Audio, making some of the most forward-looking effects for about the past 40 years or so. Check out any of the software they make for free at eventideaudio.com. Also, big thanks to occasional sponsor on this podcast, Sonarworks. You can check out any of we do impartial reviews on SonicScoop.com, and you can check out some of the reviews that our contributors have done on this stuff, and the thoughts on it seem to be, I'm just going to say, positive overall. People, every time a new version of Sonarworks comes out, a reviewer comes to me saying, can I review the new version? Because they want Sonarworks for free, because they really want, and that's why they want to write the review. I know it. So anyway, it's becoming a staple in studios. Congrats to the success of Sonarworks, and keep on doing what you guys do, Martins.
Thank you. We'll keep on doing that good stuff.
All right. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. See you next time.